The national question is still not a thing of the past in Britain. We now have a National Assembly in Wales with limited lawmaking powers, but with little economic power and only a very limited remit to raise capital funds through borrowing. The Scottish Parliament has more extensive legislative powers and a circumscribed capacity to raise taxation. The SNP government in Edinburgh is pledged to hold a referendum on independence in the year 2014. The position that the Communist Party of Britain and its Scottish organisation is likely to take in the referendum is set out in the new edition of our programme, Britain's Road to Socialism. We are for substantial devolution of power from the highly centralised British state to the nations of Britain, including substantial economic and financial powers, as well as to the regions and localities. In particular, we want the Scottish and Welsh governments to have the power and resources to intervene decisively in the economy of their countries in the interests of workers and the people generally, challenging the monopolies and their unfree market as and when necessary. This is a vital part of our perspective for the exercise of popular sovereignty, for the people to enforce their interests over those of monopoly capital. And if that puts those governments, those peoples, and those workers on a collision course with the European Union, so be it. We uphold the right of the Scottish people and their elected representatives to hold a referendum on the terms that they decide, and to achieve independence should that be the people's decision. But we oppose the separation of Scotland or Wales in current conditions. You may well ask, especially afterwards when we have questions, you may well ask why. Because our assessment is that any benefits from independence would be outweighed by the disbenefits likely to arise from economic dislocation, an upsurge in competing nationalisms, and above all, from the rupture of working class and progressive unity built up between the peoples of Scotland and England and Wales through 2 centuries of struggle and solidarity. Our assessment is that the unity of British monopoly capital would survive national separation largely intact, and would undoubtedly play off the separate states against each other as their labour and progressive movements are divided. These do not provide more favourable conditions for overthrowing state monopoly capitalism, which is why our opposition to such a trajectory is revolutionary and strategic. It is not based on British unionism or British nationalism. Indeed, we don't believe that the left and the Labour movement shall have anything to do with the reactionary arguments that will be deployed against Scottish independence. Of course, for instance, the people of Scotland are as capable of governing their own country as the people of Switzerland or Swaziland. High levels of social welfare spending in Scotland are not proof of English or British generosity. They are evidence of continuing central government failure to challenge the consequences of capitalist monopoly power, of capitalist market anarchy, and of capitalism's uneven economic development. Nor are we interested in making or keeping Britain stronger in Europe or the world. In fact, breaking up British imperialist power would be one of the most desirable results of breaking up the British state, except that it would not happen. The British capitalist class would retain its enormous economic and financial assets around the world, all of them beyond the reach of the Scottish state. Scotland would continue to be a dominion of the European Union and NATO, and in the short to medium term at least, England would be a particularly aggressive nuclear-armed force in international affairs allied to the United States. Furthermore, the indications are that an SNP-led independent Scotland would engage in a race to the bottom with the rest of Britain in the field of corporate taxation. The SNP and Plaid Cymru's slogan of independence in Europe is, in our view, a cynical hoax on the peoples of those countries. There is no independence within the EU for small nations who will be subject to EU laws, treaties and institutions without any of the power to influence or determine them enjoyed by the major imperialist member states. That is why the Communist Party rejects both reactionary unionism and reactionary separatism. Britain's road to socialism makes clear our commitment to a united fight for a progressive democratic federation of self-governing nations, with the national and British governments pursuing a left-wing programme of anti-monopoly policies, free of nuclear weapons and breaking with British imperialism. A longer-term constitutional settlement based on the unity of three nations of Britain, combined with substantial powers of self-government for each, might take the form of a federal system with new structures that reflected their equal status. We also believe that the distinctive cultural and social characteristics of Cornwall should be expressed through a directly elected Cornish Assembly, with powers that match local aspirations. The special tax haven status enjoyed by finance capital on the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands, which are run politically as semi-feudal fiefdoms, should be ended. The peoples of those islands should be democratically represented in the Westminster Parliament, with their own democratic parliaments, Tynwald and the States, strengthened by proportional representation and economic powers like those proposed for Wales and Scotland. Comrades, communists propose extensive economic and financial powers for Wales and Scotland so that their governments and parliaments can intervene effectively in relation to monopoly capital in today's context of capitalist or imperialist globalization. Our programme argues that counter-revolution and the dismantling of socialism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union from the late 1980s opened up enormous opportunities for monopoly capital to seize control of resources, transportation routes, utilities and markets in the former socialist countries and the Third World. The result has been a prolonged and continuing worldwide imperialist offensive to maximise monopoly profit through neoliberal policies of privatisation, deregulation, intensified exploitation of labour and the free movement of Western capital. This imperialist globalisation is presented by its supporters and apologists as an inevitable economic process. However, from the outset, it has been driven politically by the most powerful state monopoly capitalisms, notably those of the United States, Britain and Germany, often acting through new or existing international agencies, such as the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and the General Agreement on Trade in Services. Third world countries whose regimes are deemed to be obstructing imperialist globalization have been demonized as rogue or failed states. They're accused of frustrating the will of the international community, which usually means the United States and its allies. Consequently, sanctions and other destabilizing measures have culminated in military aggression against Iraq, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Afghanistan, and Yugoslavia. The bogus war on terror has been the cover for extending and deepening Western imperialism's military, political and economic influence across the greater Middle East region, from North Africa to Pakistan, inflicting state terrorism on the peoples of Afghanistan and Iraq on a monstrous scale. China is almost completely surrounded by imperialist military alliances and bases, while foregoing any bases of its own on foreign territory. Another major casualty of imperialist globalization has been the progress that was made in resolving national inequalities and conflicts within the former socialist states of Central and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union since at least the early 1950s. Yugoslavia has been torn apart by imperialist intrigue and national chauvinism, and large parts of it colonized by German monopoly capital in particular. Czechoslovakia has been split into two even more unequal halves, one of them occupied by German, French and British capital, even though both peoples have far more in common, geographically, historically and linguistically, than their differences. Most of the former socialist countries have collapsed into the arms of the European Union, which itself has played a leading role in promoting globalization, confirming the EU's character as an alliance led by the most powerful, or in Britain's case, the multinational state. The EU, NATO, the IMF, and other international agencies designed to operate in imperialism's common interests were created by and rest upon the national state power exercised by the capitalist class based in their respective countries. Without that state power, whether in the US, Germany, Britain or France, those agencies would tumble like a house of cards. For socialists and communists, therefore, our most profound internationalist duty remains to carry through socialist revolution in our own country. This is also, after all, the level at which working class and progressive democratic movements have struggled to develop their organizations, their political consciousness and their democratic rights. For communists and the working class movement to neglect this arena in pursuit of some will-o'-the-wisp United Socialist States of Europe or the suchlike is to sacrifice the fundamental permanent interests of the working class in favour of a mirage. It would represent opportunism of a potentially very damaging kind. Imperialist globalization has already demonstrated its willingness and ability to trample upon national rights and sovereignty. At the same time, it purports to embrace the rights of small nations and nationalities when and where it suits imperialist interests to do so. Also looked to the future indeed when he wrote, "All nations will arrive at socialism. This is inevitable, but all will do so in not exactly the same way. Each will contribute something of its own to some form of democracy, to some variety of the dictatorship of the proletariat. There is nothing more primitive from the viewpoint of theory, or more ridiculous from that of practice, than to paint, in the name of historical materialism, this aspect of the future in a monotonous grey. Heddiw, yn gymaint ag erioed, mae safbwynt athronyddol, Marxiaeth Leniniaeth yn cyfuno'r cwestiwn cenedlaethol a'r un genedlaetholdeb, a'r unig sail y gall sicrhau datblygu rydd i bob cenedl, i bob cenedligrwydd ac i bobl y byd yn cyffredinol. A'r sail y frwydr dosbarth gwleidyddol yn erbyn cyfalafiaeth ac imperialaeth ac o blaid sosialaeth a chomunyddiaeth. Today, as much as ever, the Marxist-Leninist worldview synthesizes the national question and internationalism on the only basis that can ensure the free development of every nation and nationality and of humanity as a whole, on the basis of the political class struggle against capitalism and imperialism, for socialism and communism.